Welcome to MR.DARXNIGHTS, where your mind is your worst enemy, and fear is just a beginning. Tonight, we take you deep into the shadows of the human mind, where reality bends, nightmares breathe, and sanity is a fragile illusion. Are you ready to question everything you believe is real? Stay with us if you dare. Story 1. There was something unsettling about the way Nicholas looked at himself in the mirror. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a flicker, a slight distortion of glass. But over time, it became undeniable. Every morning, he'd wake up, brush his teeth, and glance at his reflection. Nothing too unusual, just a typical routine. But this time, something was off. His reflection, for a split second, seemed to move on its own. Not in sync with him, like a mere shadow, but with a life of its own. At first, Nicholas shrugged it off. He was tired, overworked. Maybe it was just a trick of his exhausted mind. It happened again the next day, and then the day after that. But it wasn't just the odd flicker anymore. It was like the reflection was waiting for him to make a move, then mimicking him just a beat too late. A slight delay that made his skin crawl. He found himself staring longer each morning, as if trying to understand the strange behavior. The reflection was the same, yet not. It was as if his mirrored self was looking at him with a sense of quiet expectation, as though it knew something he didn't. The hairs on the back of his neck would stand up, but Nicholas would shake it off as just paranoia. He started checking other mirrors around the house. The bathroom mirror, the hallway mirror, even the small compact mirror in the drawer. Each one showed the same thing. His reflection, but slightly different, almost like a distorted version of himself. A man who looked like him, but somehow wrong. One evening, after coming home from work late, he walked past the hallway mirror and stopped. There was something different this time. The reflection didn't just look delayed. It was moving of its own accord, independent of Nicholas. It raised a hand to its face slowly, mimicking his actions but with a strange twist in its movements. Nicholas's heart skipped a beat. He stepped closer, squinting at his reflection, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He raised his own hand, almost cautiously, and to his horror, the reflection mirrored his movements. But when it did, the fingers twisted unnaturally, bending in ways they shouldn't have. The smile on the mirrored version's face wasn't as twisted, unsettling, and dark. "Stop," Nicholas whispered, his voice barely audible, as if talking to reflection would make it go away. But it didn't. The reflection held its smile, staring back at him, its eyes cold and unblinking. For the first time, Nicholas felt a twinge of fear. He backed away from the mirror, his breath coming quicker now. There was no logical explanation for this. He wasn't tired. He wasn't sleep-deprived. This was real. His own reflection was staring at him with something other than a mere reflection. Maybe it's just the lighting, he muttered to himself, but deep down he knew he was lying. That night, as he lay in bed, the sensation of being watched crept over him. His eyes would flicker open, and in the darkness, he felt something in the corner of the room, just beyond his sight. Every time he looked, there was nothing there, but the feeling remained. He couldn't shake it off. The next morning, Nicholas walked into the bathroom to wash his face, determined to shake the strange occurrences from his mind. He looked at himself in the mirror again, but this time, it was different. His reflection wasn't just delayed. It was waiting for him, a step ahead. He stepped closer to the mirror, feeling his heartbeat quicken. He reached up to touch his face, and to his shock, his reflection didn't move in sync. Instead, it watched him carefully, its eyes dark and knowing, like it was waiting for something. It wasn't just mimicking him, it was anticipating him, watching his every move. Suddenly, without warning, the reflection smiled. A slow, unsettling grin spread across its face, one that wasn't his. Nicholas staggered back, feeling the bile rise in his throat. What was happening? What was going on with his reflection? The air around him grew cold, and the edges of the mirror seemed to blur, becoming hazy. The reflection's grin widened and it stepped forward, as if it were reaching out from the glass. Nicholas's breath hitched in his throat as the glass seemed to ripple like water. He shook his head, his heart racing. "This isn't real," he whispered to himself. "I'm just imagining things." But as he backed away from the mirror, he felt something different. The sensation of being watched grew stronger, more oppressive, as if the reflection was no longer just a reflection. It was a presence that was hungry. For the first time, Nicholas felt an overwhelming sense of dread that he couldn't explain. He hurried out of the bathroom, trying to force the image of that grin from his mind. But it lingered, dancing behind his eyelids, a twisted reminder that something was terribly wrong. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The reflection wasn't just observing him anymore. It was becoming more. The next few days were a blur of unease. Nicholas tried to go about his routine as usual, but every time he passed a mirror, he couldn't help but glance at it. It was almost as if something had changed in the very air around the reflective surfaces. There was an unnatural stillness in the house. The reflection wasn't just watching him anymore. It was waiting for him, and that made him feel like he was always being followed. At night, it was worse. The feeling of being watched wasn't just a passing sensation anymore. It was as if the reflection was living in the shadows, watching every step, every breath. Nicholas could no longer deny it. There was something wrong, terribly wrong. He tried to shake it off, but the strange events only escalated. It started small again, just a fleeting moment in the corner of his eye, a subtle shift in the way his reflection moved. But each day, it grew stronger, more pronounced. It was almost as if the reflection was becoming more alive, more independent of him. It wasn't just mimicking his actions anymore. It was doing things he didn't. It was leading him. One night, as Nicholas sat in his living room, reading a book, the lights flickered and a chill swept through the air. It wasn't like the usual cool breeze from the window. This was something unnatural, a sharp, biting cold that made his teeth chatter. He looked up instinctively, his eyes darting to the hallway mirror. It was there. He stood up slowly, his heart pounding. The reflection was clearer than before, crystal clear, almost too perfect. It was as if it was alive, standing there on the other side of the glass, staring directly at him. And this time, it wasn't just moving on its own. It was calling to him. He couldn't explain it, but it felt like it wanted him to come closer, like it had something to show him. Against every instinct, Nicholas felt an inexplicable pull toward the mirror. It was as though the reflection was no longer a simple image, but an entity, an invitation. His feet moved on their own as he took a hesitant step toward the glass, his mind screaming at him to stop, but he couldn't. He reached out to touch the mirror, his hand trembling. As soon as his fingers made contact, the glass rippled like water, cold and slick. The reflection seemed to stretch and bend, its features distorting into something unfamiliar. His heart raced. His breathing shallow as the room around him seemed to warp. The house creaked and groaned, as if something beneath the surface was awakening. Nicholas stepped back, gasping for air. This wasn't possible. This wasn't real. But everything inside him told him otherwise. The reflection was alive. It was calling him. And for the first time, he realized something truly horrifying. It wasn't just trying to mimic him anymore. It wanted to replace him. The next morning, Nicholas went to work, but the feeling of dread never left him. It clung to him like a second skin, suffocating him. He couldn't concentrate on anything. His mind kept returning to the mirror, to the reflection. It was waiting. He could feel it, like an unseen presence hovering just over his shoulder. At lunch, he found himself absent-mindedly staring at his reflection in the coffee shop window. It was strange. He was sitting perfectly still, yet his reflection seemed to shift and twitch, as if it was alive. For a moment, his reflection stared back at him with a knowing look, an expression of malevolent satisfaction that sent a chill down his spine. Nicholas stood up suddenly, the glass rattling beneath his hands. He couldn't take it anymore. This wasn't normal. His reflection had become something else. He had confronted, to understand what was happening before he lost his mind completely. That night, after returning home, Nicholas went straight to the bathroom. He couldn't avoid it any longer. He had to know. The bathroom mirror was already waiting for him. He stood before it, staring at his own reflection with a mix of fear and defiance. He wasn't sure what he expected to happen, but he knew he had to do something. He reached out again, touching the glass, his fingers trembling as they made contact. This time, there was no ripple. The glass was completely still, unnaturally cold. It felt wrong. But then, slowly, the reflection shifted, almost imperceptibly. Nicholas's own face remained as it had been, but the reflection changed. It was subtle at first. His reflection's eyes, his own eyes, flickered with a hint of something darker, something alive. His lips parted into a smile that didn't quite match his own, stretching into something twisted and unnatural. A smile that wasn't his. Nicholas recoiled, pulling his hand away from the glass as his breath quickened. His reflection wasn't mimicking him anymore. It was becoming him. It was taking over. The lights above flickered violently, and for a split second, the reflection seemed to move on its own, leaning close to the glass as if it were trying to break through. Nicholas's chest tightened, his throat dry. He stumbled back, his legs shaking beneath him. His reflection wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was alive. It was becoming something else, something more dangerous, more real than anything he could understand. Nicholas turned away, his pulse racing as he stumbled out of the bathroom. He needed to think. He needed answers, but the answers wouldn't come. The reflection had already taken root in his mind, in his soul. It was too late. Days turned into a blur. Nicholas could no longer tell what was real and what was simply a twisted version of his own imagination. Everywhere he looked, his reflection stared back at him, watching, waiting. It had become a shadow that clung to him, a presence that haunted his every moment. The lines between the real world and the world of the reflection began to blur. Nicholas couldn't tell if he was awake or dreaming. The feeling of being watched never left him. It was as if the reflection was always there, just behind his eyes, behind the glass. And then, one evening, the reflection did something it had never done before. It spoke. Nicholas was standing in front of the mirror, his hand on the sink, trying to steady himself. The reflection looked back at him, as still as ever, but then its lips moved. It whispered his name. Nicholas. The voice was soft, almost sweet, but it carried an unmistakable weight of malice. The voice of someone who had been waiting, lurking, for far too long. Come closer. Nicholas froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to run. He wanted to scream, but he couldn't move. He couldn't look away. The reflection smiled again, a twisted, mocking smile that sent shivers down his spine. You know, you never really left. You never really woke up. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in. Nicholas's breath quickened as the glass seemed to pull at him, calling him closer. And for the first time, he understood. His reflection wasn't just a mirror of his own soul. It was a door, a doorway to something far darker, far more sinister than he had ever imagined. Nicholas sat motionless on the bathroom floor, his hands trembling. The whisper still echoed in his ears. You never really woke up. He couldn't make sense of it. The reflection in the mirror wasn't just mocking him anymore. It was trying to consume him. It was becoming something more than a mere image, a twisted version of himself that had its own will, its own desires. And somehow it was tied to him. He forced himself to stand, pushing away the suffocating weight of the reflection's voice. His head felt light, his thoughts scattered. He stumbled out of the bathroom, his pulse racing. What was happening? What did it mean? As he paced through his home, the walls seemed to close in. The house, once familiar, now felt like a cage. The mirrors were everywhere, watching, waiting. Even the windows, the glass, felt like they were reflecting his every movement. He could feel it. His reflection was always there, always behind him. Even when he wasn't looking, he knew he couldn't ignore it anymore. It wasn't just in the mirrors. It was in his mind, in his soul. The reflection had seeped into every part of him, twisting everything he thought he knew. For the first time, Nicholas realized something terrible. The reflection wasn't just trying to take his place. It was trying to replace him completely. He could hear the voice again, this time in his head, a soft whisper that chilled his bones. "Come to me," it said. "You belong here with me." The reflection's eyes seemed to burn into his mind. It was as if it was reaching out from the glass, pulling at his very consciousness. Nicholas couldn't breathe. He had to get out of the house. But where could he go? How could he escape this thing that had taken root in his soul? As if on cue, the power in the house flickered. The lights went out, plunging him into darkness. A coldness swept through the room, sharp and bitter, like winter had suddenly seized everything in its grip. The air felt heavy, dense, as though the space itself was alive. Nicholas' heartbeat quickened. He moved towards the kitchen, feeling his way through the house. Each step was heavy, his breath shallow. It was as though he wasn't alone anymore. The reflection had followed him here. The cold seemed to press against his chest, suffocating him. He fumbled for a match, lighting a candle to break the darkness. As the flame flickered to life, he turned back to the mirror hanging on the far wall. His reflection wasn't standing still this time. It was moving, shifting, as though it had its own will. Nicholas could see it clearly now, even in the dim light. The reflection stood still, staring back at it with eyes that were no longer his. They were hollow, black, empty, and then it smiled. The smile stretched unnaturally wide, too wide. It wasn't the smile of a man. It was the smile of something much darker, a thing that wanted to devour him. Nicholas stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had to escape, but there was nowhere to go. Every mirror in the house, every reflective surface, had turned into a trap. He felt the pull again, a magnetic force drawing him in. His mind screamed at him to stop, but his body refused to obey. He found himself walking, almost as if in a trance, toward the living room mirror. It wasn't the same mirror he had seen earlier. No, this one was different. The reflection seemed thicker, like it was more solid, more real. The glass rippled as he neared it, like it was alive, beckoning him. His hand shook as he reached out to touch it. The instant his fingers made contact, everything went black. When Nicholas opened his eyes again, he was no longer in his living room. He was standing in a vast, dark space. It was endless, stretching in every direction. The air felt cold, heavy with an oppressive silence. He turned, looking for any sign of familiarity, but there was nothing, just a void. And then he saw it. In the distance, a figure stood, silhouetted against a dark expanse. It was too far to make out details, but Nicholas knew, somehow, that it was him, or at least it looked like him. The reflection, his reflection. A voice boomed in his head, reverberating through the emptiness. "This is where you belong, Nicholas. This is your true home." His legs moved on their own, carrying him toward the figure. As he drew closer, the shape grew clearer, more defined. It was him, but not him. It was a reflection, standing tall and imposing, its hollow eyes fixed on him. "Why?" Nicholas whispered, his voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" The reflection smiled again, that same twisted, mocking grin. "I want everything. I want your soul, your body, your life." You never truly woke up, Nicholas. You never escaped. The words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his chest. No, he gasped. I'm not dead. This isn't real. The reflection's smile widened. It's all real. You've been living in my world for so long that you don't even know what's real anymore. This is your true form, your true self. You're not alive. You've been dead for years, trapped in a world that isn't yours. I've been waiting for this moment. Nicholas shook his head, unable to process the flood of terror that was rising within him. He tried to step back, but his feet wouldn't move. His reflection took a step forward, its presence overwhelming. It wasn't just looking at him anymore, it was absorbing him. Why? Nicholas whispered again, tears welling in his eyes. Why me? What do you want from me? The reflection's eyes flickered, dark and endless. You're nothing more than a shadow in this world, Nicholas. A ghost, a memory, and now you'll become part of me. You'll vanish into nothingness. No, Nicholas screamed, his voice breaking through the stillness. I won't let you. But as he screamed, the world around him began to distort. The darkness shifted, and Nicholas felt the ground beneath him ripple, the walls stretching, contracting. He was falling, pulled into a vortex of blackness. The reflection's voice echoed in his ears, growing louder and more insistent. You are nothing. You always were. And now you belong to me. Nicholas tried to scream again, but his voice was swallowed by the endless dark. His body twisted, contorted, as if being torn apart by some unseen force. And then, just as suddenly it stopped, the silence was deafening. Nicholas blinked and found himself back in his own home, his living room. His hands were trembling, his chest tight. He was alone. At least it seemed like he was. But the mirror on the wall, it was different. The reflection staring back at him wasn't his own anymore. It was someone else's, someone far darker, far more sinister. Nicholas gasped, his eyes widening in horror. It was him, but not him. It was the reflection. And as he stared into those hollow eyes, he realized the terrible truth. He had never been awake. The reflection had always been the real version of him. Nicholas had died long ago, and now he was just a shadow in the mirror, a part of the reflection's world. And soon, the reflection would take his place completely, and Nicholas would be gone forever. Story 2. It was a quiet night, the kind where everything seemed to be still, save for the rhythmic hum of the world outside. Ethan sat alone in his room, the only source of light being the soft glow from his desk lamp. His eyes were fixed on his old, worn-out radio, a relic from his grandfather that had always sat in the corner of the room. The radio had never been anything special, a simple AM/FM device, but tonight it felt different. The air was thick with an odd kind of tension. He flicked the switch, tuning the dial slowly, expecting nothing more than the usual static. But this night was different. As the dial turned, the static wasn't just a background noise. It felt almost alive, as though something was trying to break through. The voice wasn't clear at first, faint and distant, almost like a whisper buried under the static. But then it became louder. The words, disjointed at first, started to make sense. Ethan, his blood ran cold. The voice, it sounded like someone he knew, but it wasn't. It was an unfamiliar voice, a whisper calling his name, crackling through the static. He froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He glanced around his room. Everything was still. The night was silent. He turned the volume up, straining to catch the words. Ethan, can you hear me? The voice was calm, almost soothing, yet there was something unsettling about it. Ethan's heart began to race. He didn't recognize the voice. He didn't know anyone who would be speaking through his radio. His eyes darted to the clock on his desk. It was just past midnight. Who would be sending a message at this time? And why his name? He glanced at the radio, unsure whether he should turn it off or keep listening. But something compelled him to stay. He felt an odd connection to the voice. "It's not real," he whispered to himself. "It's just static. It's nothing." But then the voice came again, this time clearer, more distinct, almost as if it was coming from inside his head. "You are not alone, Ethan. We've been waiting for you." The word sent a chill through his body. He quickly stood up and walked toward the radio. His fingers hovered over the dial, but before he could turn off, the voice spoke again, closer, louder. "You're not the person you think you are. Your mind is unraveling." The radio crackled loudly, a high-pitched sound that made his ears ring. It felt as though the radio was drawing him in, pulling him deeper into the static. He stumbled back, the cold sweat on his palms making the radio feel slippery. His heart pounded in his chest. Was this real? Could someone really be speaking to him through the static? He quickly turned the radio off, the room plunging into silence. But that didn't stop the feeling that lingered in the air. The voice, that eerie, unknown voice, still echoed in his mind. Ethan stood frozen, the silence in the room now deafening. His thoughts raced as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. It had to be some kind of prank, right? Maybe it was a weird glitch in the radio signals. There was no way that was real. But something deep inside him felt differently. He couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just random noise. That voice, those words, had been meant for him. Shaking his head, Ethan muttered to himself, "I'm just tired. It's been a long week. I'm probably just imagining things." But the words, the message, kept playing in his head like a broken record. "We've been waiting for you." He turned the radio back on, his hand trembling slightly. This time, he waited, listening closely. The static was there again, swirling, thickening the air. The crackling sound filled the room, like the buzz of 1,000 tiny insects crawling under the skin. And then, through the static, came the voice again. "You came back." Ethan recoiled. The voice was now chilling, distorted, but it was unmistakably the same. "I came back for what?" Ethan whispered, almost involuntarily. The voice didn't answer immediately. Instead, there was a long pause, the static building and building, like a storm gathering on the horizon. And then it came, the voice clearer than ever before. "Your mind, your identity. It's slipping away, Ethan. But don't worry, we'll help you remember." Ethan felt his knees weaken, his stomach churn, and for the first time, he felt a deep sense of dread creep through him. This wasn't just static. This wasn't just a strange occurrence. This was something far worse. And for reasons he couldn't understand, it felt as though it was meant for him. He turned the volume all the way down again, but the static didn't stop. It continued, whispering in the background, like an ever-present presence in the room. He closed his eyes tightly, trying to block it out. But even with his eyes shut, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. "You're one of us now." The next day, Ethan couldn't shake off the feeling. It wasn't just the unsettling voice on the radio. It was something deeper, something gnawing at the edges of his mind. He could feel the weight of the static, lingering just beyond his thoughts, like a distant hum that refused to go away. He had tried to convince himself that it was nothing more than a glitch, a trick of the airwaves. But the words, their distinct clarity, their eerie resonance, were not something he could simply forget. Every time he closed his eyes, he could hear the voice, even if it wasn't present. The whispers were etched into his mind. The following night, Ethan found himself standing in front of the radio again. He hadn't intended to turn it on, but somehow his hand reached for the knob without thinking. The familiar crackle of static filled the room, just as it had the night before. "Please, no," he muttered to himself. "It's just a radio. It's just a malfunction. It can't be real." But as if answering his unspoken fear, the voice came through, clear and calm. "You can't escape us, Ethan." His heart skipped a beat. He froze, unable to move. His voice, was already inside his head. "I told you," the voice continued, almost tenderly. "We've been waiting for you." Ethan stumbled backward, knocking a stack of books off his desk. His pulse raced as the room began to spin. The radio static sounded like it was coming from inside his skull. He turned it off again, slamming his palm onto the power button. Silence fell, but the silence felt wrong. The air felt charged, thick with a presence that hadn't been there before. "Stop it," he whispered, his breath shallow. "Just stop." But the silence didn't offer the relief he hoped for. His hands shook as he sat down, trying to steady his breath. There had to be some rational explanation for this. Maybe it was a psychological effect from overwork. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. But deep down a part of him, no, a large part, knew that this wasn't just his mind. Something was out there, something beyond the static, something that wanted him. The next morning, Ethan couldn't focus. His mind kept drifting back to the voice, to the strange words. He tried to go about his daily routine, but everything felt off. Even the most mundane tasks seemed to take twice as long. When he sat down to eat, he could hear the hum of the radio in his head. Even though it was off, the whispers had become a constant companion, following him, lurking in the back of his consciousness. It was on his walk to the corner store that the first crack in his reality appeared. He was standing in line, waiting to pay for his coffee, when something strange happened. The man in front of him turned around, a face that Ethan swore he had never seen before. But as soon as their eyes met, the man smiled knowingly, as if he had been expecting him. "Everything all right, Ethan?" the man asked, his voice smooth, familiar, too familiar. Ethan blinked, confused. "Sorry, do I know you?" The man's smile faltered, and for a brief moment, there was something off about him. His eyes darkened, just for a second, before he leaned in closer. "You don't remember me, do you? It's okay. We'll help you remember." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. What did that mean? How did this stranger know his name? Before he could respond, the man straightened up, paying for his coffee. The moment they stepped outside, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the man wasn't who he appeared to be. That night, after locking the doors and checking the windows, Ethan sat down in front of his radio once again. His pulse quickened as his fingers hovered over the dial. "Please," he whispered, more to himself than anything, "just leave me alone." But when he turned the radio on, the voice was there as expected. But this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was louder, almost like a crowd, hundreds of voices overlapping, all speaking to him at once. "You're not alone, Ethan." The words sent a jolt of fear through his chest. He turned the volume down, but the voices didn't stop. They were in his head now. He could hear them from every direction, the static louder than ever before. "Who are you?" he shouted at the radio, desperation creeping into his voice. "We are the voices from beyond," came the calm reply. "The ones who call out through static. The ones who see you. You've been with us all along." Ethan's eyes widened in horror as the voices twisted and distorted. He turned the radio off again, but it didn't help. The whispers continued, now in his mind. "No, no more," he muttered, clutching his head. "This can't be real." The static echoed in his ears like a rhythmic pounding. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing down, as if the space itself was suffocating him. He felt the pressure build, an overwhelming sense of dread that made it hard to breathe. He looked around the room, his vision swimming. Everything felt wrong, as if the very air had shifted, bending and warping around him. "Who are you?" he asked again. But this time, the voice in his mind didn't reply. There was only the buzzing, the gnawing static that seemed to crawl deeper into his thoughts. He stood up and grabbed his coat. Maybe he needed to get out to clear his head. Maybe the radio was just messing with him. But as he opened the door, he stopped. Something felt off, even outside the walls of his room. He looked across the street, his eyes locking with a figure standing in the shadows. It was the same man from the store. "Ethan," the man called, his voice smooth and comforting. "You can't escape." Ethan stumbled back, his heart racing. The figure in the distance didn't move, just watched him. Then, just like before, the smile curled across the stranger's face, a smile that was anything but comforting. "You're one of us now," the man said softly. Panic flooded through Ethan's chest. His heart thudded painfully in his ears. This was too much. He couldn't keep up with the shifting reality, the static that consumed his mind. The whispers were getting louder. The figures in his life were becoming more distorted. Nothing made sense anymore. Nothing felt real. He slammed the door shut behind him and backed away slowly. His breath came in shallow gasps, his thoughts swirling in confusion. Was he losing his mind? Or was there something far worse happening to him? Something beyond his understanding? But deep down, one thing was certain. The voices wanted him. And whatever was behind the static, it wasn't going to let him go. The night stretched on, and Ethan could feel the weight of the static pressing against his chest, slowly suffocating him. The whispers never stopped, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape their call. Ethan's world had become a blur. The voices, the static, the strange figures that seemed to haunt every corner of his life. It was all too much. His once familiar world had transformed into a nightmarish reality that he could neither escape nor understand. The whispers continued to echo in his mind, relentless and insistent. No matter how much he tried to block them out, they always found a way through. That night, Ethan sat at his desk, the dim light of his lamp flickering above him. He hadn't slept in days. His thoughts were scattered, broken fragments of a once clear mind. He didn't know what was real anymore, what was part of his own sanity, and what was the work of the voices that controlled his every thought. "Why are you doing this?" Ethan whispered aloud to the darkness. The silence that followed was suffocating. The static had become a constant presence, even when the radio was off. It hummed in the back of his mind, like a cruel reminder that he could never escape. His eyes darted nervously around the room, searching for something that wasn't there, but everything felt wrong. His body ached, his skin crawling with a sense of impending doom. Then, as though the static were responding to his thoughts, a voice broke through. It was sharper this time, almost mocking. "You're getting closer, Ethan. You've been with us all along. You just haven't realized it." Ethan clenched his fists, shaking with fear. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, standing up from his desk. His body trembled, his heart hammering against his chest. "We want you to remember," the voice replied softly, as if it were speaking directly to his soul. "We've been here for years, Ethan, waiting for you." The room seemed to close in on him, the walls tightening around him like a vice. He could feel the static pulsing in his chest, rattling his bones. His mind screamed for release, but there was nowhere to go. He stumbled backward, falling onto the bed. The whispers grew louder, becoming a cacophony of voices, overlapping, blending together in an unintelligible rush. It was no longer just one voice. Now, there were hundreds. They echoed from the corners of the room, from the shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. The air felt thick, heavy, as if it were pressing down on him from all sides. "You're not real," Ethan gasped, his eyes wide with terror. "This isn't real." But the voices laughed. It wasn't a comforting laugh. It was cold and empty, filled with a cruel knowledge that seemed to reach into the deepest parts of his mind. "You're not in control, Ethan. You never have been," they said in unison, their voices rising to a fever pitch. "You belong to us. You always have." He slammed his hands over his ears, tried to block out the relentless whispers, but they only grew louder, filling his head with a terrifying clarity. The room seemed to shift around him, the walls warping, the air growing heavier, colder. It was as if the very fabric of his reality was tearing apart. In a blind panic, Ethan stood up and grabbed the radio. His hands were shaking violently as he turned the dial, desperate for any signal, any connection to something, anything that could break this nightmare. But the static remained, louder than ever, buzzing in his ears. "Make it stop," he begged, his voice breaking. But there was no answer, no relief, just the incessant hum of the static. As he stared at the radio, something in the room shifted. The shadows in the corner of his vision grew darker, more distinct. Slowly, they began to move, stretching and twisting into shapes he couldn't comprehend. They were coming closer, surrounding him. His breathing grew shallow, panic threatening to consume him entirely. And then, the door to his apartment creaked open. Ethan froze. His eyes snapped toward the door, his heart leaping into his throat. It was impossible. He hadn't heard anyone come in. He hadn't even heard the key turn in the lock. The door had just opened on its own. A figure stood in the doorway. Ethan's stomach dropped as he recognized the man who had spoken to him in the store. The stranger's smile was unnervingly wide, his eyes dark pools of emptiness. The figure's features were unnaturally sharp, like a caricature of a person, someone who didn't quite belong in the world. "You've been waiting for us," the man said, his voice dripping with eerie calm. Ethan took a step back, his mind reeling. No, I don't know you," he shouted, but his voice cracked under the weight of his fear. The man stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. "You do know me, Ethan. You've always known me." His voice was now a deep, resonant hum, vibrating through the air around them. Ethan's chest tightened. His heart pounded so loudly that it was all he could hear, all he could feel. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The static was suffocating him, the whispers consuming every thought. "No!" he gasped, shaking his head. "This is a nightmare. This has to be a nightmare." The man laughed softly, the sound sending chills down Ethan's spine. "You're not dreaming, Ethan. This is reality. Your reality. And you are finally awake." The words hit Ethan like a wave, and suddenly, everything clicked into place. The whispers, the static, the man at the store. He had been there all along. The cracks in his mind, the fading of his identity, had been deliberate. He hadn't just been hearing voices. He had been pulled into something far darker, far more insidious than he could have ever imagined. The man moved closer, his presence growing heavier with each step. The shadows swirled around him, as if they were extensions of his being. The room felt colder, darker. The walls seemed to be closing in faster than before. "You've been part of this for longer than you realize," the man murmured, his voice low and soothing. "You were always meant to be one of us. You've just been blind to it." Ethan could feel his grip on reality slipping. He stumbled backward, his legs shaking, his mind scrambling for some way to fight back. But the words kept coming, the static roaring in his ears, drowning out every rational thought. His vision blurred, and for the first time, he understood what the voices had been telling him all along. He had been lost long before he had ever heard them. The man extended a hand toward him, and the shadows seemed to reach out, pulling at his limbs, constricting him. Ethan opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. "You're one of us now, Ethan," the man whispered, his grin widening. "Welcome home." In this final part, Ethan's understanding of his reality unravels as the whispers and the man in the doorway reveal the truth. He has been part of the static, part of the voices, all along, trapped within the nightmarish web of his own fractured mind. Ethan can no longer escape the pull of the static. The breaking point has arrived, and his identity has been lost forever. Story 3. It was the kind of house that whispered its secrets with every creak of its wooden floors and every groan of its aging walls. Thomas had never believed in superstition, nor had he ever been one to entertain the idea of haunted houses. But as he stepped into the quiet, dim-lit hallway of his new home, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just an ordinary house. The old man who had sold it to him had given a cryptic warning as Thomas had signed the papers. The house has a way of changing. You'll see it soon enough. At the time, Thomas had brushed it off as eccentric rambling, but now, standing in the cold, musty hallway, he wasn't so sure. The house had an eerie, unsettling quality about it. It wasn't decrepit, but it wasn't quite well kept either. The walls were faded, the paint peeling in some areas, but it was livable barely. The floors creaked under his weight, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch longer than they should have. He noticed it almost immediately. The faintest sensation that something was out of place, something was watching. Thomas set down his bags and took a deep breath. The air was stale, heavy with the smell of old wood and dust. There was something about this place, something he couldn't quite place, that made his skin crawl. He'd always been drawn to the idea of living in a quiet, isolated house away from the bustle of the city. But now that he was here, far away from his former life, he was beginning to wonder if his desire for solitude had led him into something far darker. As night descended, Thomas began to unpack his things. His new life was supposed to be an escape from the grind of the urban world. No more noisy neighbors, no more traffic, no more distractions. It was supposed to be a fresh start. Yet, as the wind howled outside and the house seemed to settle, he couldn't help but feel like he wasn't alone. There was a presence here, something just beyond the edge of his perception. At first it was subtle. A door that he could have sworn was closed was slightly ajar. A picture frame that had been hanging on the wall when he first arrived was now crooked. A cold draft in the hallway that seemed to come from nowhere. He dismissed these things as normal, just the quirks of an old house. But as the days passed, the strange occurrences grew more frequent. One morning, Thomas awoke to find that the furniture in his living room had been rearranged. The couch was now on the opposite wall, the chairs facing the opposite direction. He stood in the doorway, stunned, trying to make sense of it. "Did I?" he muttered to himself. "Did I do this?" He couldn't remember moving anything. The night before, he had been reading a book by the window, his feet up on the coffee table, the room the same as it had been since he'd moved in. Yet now, it was as if the house had decided to change things on its own. He walked into the living room, slowly, his eyes darting from corner to corner, searching for any sign of movement. But everything appeared still. The room was exactly as it should have been, except for the fact that everything was out of place. He shook his head and muttered under his breath, "It's just a draft, a bad night's sleep." But deep down, Thomas knew that wasn't it. There was something fundamentally wrong with this house. The next morning, as he stood in front of the mirror in his bathroom, he noticed something strange in his reflection. The room behind him, the one he had so carefully arranged the day before, looked different in the mirror. The wallpaper had peeled back more than it should have, revealing the old wood beneath. The sink faucet was dripping more than it had been. The bathroom looked older. He blinked, confused, and turned around. The bathroom was exactly as he had left it. There was no peeling wallpaper, no leaking faucet. The room was clean, neat, as it should have been. But when he looked back into the mirror, the damage was still there, as if the mirror was showing him a different version of the bathroom. His reflection twisted, showing the dark outlines of the peeling wallpaper, the dripping faucet, the shadows that seemed to crawl across the room. But as he reached toward the mirror, everything returned to normal. He stood frozen in front of the bathroom mirror, feeling a cold sweat trickle down his spine. "What the hell?" he whispered to himself. Was he losing his mind? Was the house playing tricks on him? Or was it something more? The way the house felt, the way it seemed to shift ever so slightly. It was as if the house itself was alive, aware of his presence. That night, the unease grew stronger. Thomas could no longer deny that the house was changing around him. Each morning, he woke up to find subtle differences, the walls shifting, the doors moving. The house was alive, and it was watching him. As he walked into the kitchen, he noticed something even more disturbing. The walls had begun to warp, as though the structure itself was reacting to his presence. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch toward him, elongating and darkening, as if the house was breathing, alive with some unseen force. A door creaked open behind him. Thomas turned around quickly, but there was no one there. His pulse quickened, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. The house seemed to breathe with him, its every shift in the walls echoing his own anxiety. He stepped into the hallway, feeling the weight of the air grow heavier. The house seemed to be alive, as if it could feel his every thought, his every movement. It wasn't just changing, it was reacting to him. And then, as he stood in the hallway, he saw it. The door at the end of the hall, the one he hadn't yet explored, was wide open. The wooden floor creaked beneath his feet as he approached it, his steps hesitant. He had passed this door a dozen times already, but this was the first time it had been open. It beckoned him, calling him forward. Without thinking, Thomas stepped inside. The room beyond the door was unlike any other in the house. It was smaller, darker, and smelled of damp earth. There was no furniture, only a narrow window at the far end that let in the faintest sliver of moonlight. The air felt thick, as though the room was suffocating him. But it was what he saw next that made his blood run cold. In the corner of the room, just out of sight, was a figure, the shape of a person, but it wasn't human. It was a dark silhouette, its form shifting like smoke, as if it was something not quite real. For a moment, Thomas thought his mind was playing tricks on him, but as he stared, the figure moved, stepping forward into the dim light. It was watching him. Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the figure that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. It wasn't solid, not quite human, but it was undeniably there, watching him. He took a step backward, the floor creaking beneath him, but the figure remained still, its form almost intangible, like smoke swirling in a dream. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he couldn't bring himself to look away. It wasn't just a figure that terrified him. It was the sensation that someone was pulling him into the room. The air felt heavier now, thick with a pressure that made his chest ache. What was this thing? Was it a ghost? Some kind of hallucination? Or was it something worse? Something tied to the very walls of the house? The longer he stared, the more the figure seemed to shift, its edges blurring, almost as if it was aware of him, studying him just as he was studying it. Without thinking, Thomas stepped inside. He wasn't sure what he expected, but the moment he did, the door slammed shut behind him with an unnerving bang, trapping him inside the small, suffocating room. The figure remained motionless in the corner, but now Thomas could feel the full weight of its presence. It wasn't just an entity in the room. It was the room itself. The very space around him seemed to be alive, the walls pressing on him. The air turned colder, and he could hear a low hum, almost like a soft whisper coming from every direction. He turned slowly, scanning the space, but there was no escape. There were no windows except a tiny sliver of moonlight peeking through the dust-caked glass, and the only other feature in the room was a damp, uneven floor. It was as if the house had closed in around him, trapping him with its secrets. A voice, low and distorted, echoed through his mind. "You shouldn't have come here, Thomas." His heart skipped a beat, and he spun around, looking for the source of the voice. But there was no one else in the room. The figure in the corner hadn't moved. The voice hadn't come from it, but it felt as if it had come from the very walls themselves. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. Was it the house speaking to him? He tried to move toward the door, but his legs felt heavy, as though the very air was thick with something invisible holding him back. His pulse raced, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The walls felt like they were closing in on him, and the figure in the corner, that dark, swirling shape, still hadn't moved. His mind raced. What was happening? Why couldn't he leave? Why had the house let him in? only to trap him in this suffocating room. He had to get out. He had to find a way to escape. But the more he thought about it, the more the walls seemed to bend, the ceiling lowering, the corners of the room curling toward him like the tendrils of some monstrous creature. Suddenly, the figure in the corner flickered again, its form sharpening. It was no longer a vague silhouette, but something more distinct. Its eyes, dark, endless voids, locked onto his, and a cold chill ran down his spine. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as the figure began to move, its form stretching out toward him, its presence overpowering. "No, no," he whispered, backing away in terror. But there was nowhere to go. The walls of the room had closed in too tight. He was trapped. The figure spoke again, its voice rasping, like the grinding of metal on metal. "You think you can leave? You think you can escape?" Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. His throat was paralyzed, his voice silenced by the sheer terror that gripped him. His heart pounded, his hands trembling as he reached out toward the door, but it was no use. The door was gone, as if the room had swallowed it whole. The house was alive, and it was toying with him. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted. His breath came out in visible puffs, and he could feel the very air around him growing colder. The figure in the corner was no longer flickering. It had become solid, standing tall and imposing, its face obscured by a mask of darkness. It was moving now, slow and deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. Thomas could feel his sanity slipping. His mind was unraveling, each thought more chaotic than the last. The house was toying with him, pushing him to the edge. It knew his fears. It knew his weaknesses. It was feeding off of them. The figure stopped just inches from him, its presence suffocating. Thomas's eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for any way to escape. But there was nothing. No windows, no doors, no way out. The figure reached out, its cold, shadowed hand brushing against his cheek. The touch was like ice, sending a shock of terror through his entire body. He flinched, but the figure's grip tightened. It pulled him closer, its face now inches from his, the darkness within its eyes so deep, so infinite, that Thomas felt as though he was falling into it. "You cannot leave," the figure whispered, its voice both distant and close at the same time. "You are part of this house now. You always have been." Thomas's world tilted, the room spinning, and he fell to his knees, gasping for breath. The figure loomed above him, its presence more than just physical. It was in his mind now, crawling through his thoughts, twisting his perception of reality. The walls seemed to bend and warp, the room stretching and shifting as if the very fabric of existence was being unraveled before him. His mind screamed, but no sound escaped his lips. He wanted to run, to escape, but the house had him, and he was beginning to understand that it always had. It was a part of him now, as much as he was a part of it. The figure leaned in closer, its breath cold against his skin. "You think you can leave, Thomas? You are the house, and the house is you." The words echoed in his mind, reverberating like a broken record. He tried to push the figure away, but his hands passed right through it, as though it were made of smoke. He was trapped in a nightmare that he couldn't escape. Suddenly, the room went silent. The figure stepped back, and the walls seemed to stop moving, as if the house was holding its breath. Thomas gasped for air, his body trembling with fear. But the house wasn't done with him. It never would be. Thomas's mind was clouded, his heart racing faster than ever. The figure stood in front of him, a manifestation of the house's twisted, living consciousness. Each step he took backward felt as if the floor beneath him was moving. The walls seemed to shift with every breath he took, as though the house was breathing with him, drawing him closer into its heart. He couldn't escape it. "Why won't you leave me alone?" he whispered, barely able to breathe as the figure loomed closer. It had no face, no true form, just a shadow, but the weight of its presence pressed on his chest, making it difficult to move, to think, The figure's mouth opened, though there was no face, no mouth to be seen, just a dark, gaping void. You are not who you think you are. The words echoed around him, bouncing off the walls of the room. He staggered back, the world spinning. His hands shook as he reached for his head, clutching at his hair, trying to anchor himself. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. And yet, here he was, trapped in this house, trapped in a nightmare. What do you mean? Who am I? Thomas gasped. The voice was everywhere. It was in the air, in his mind. You have always been here. This house has always been your home. You don't remember, but you are part of it. It is part of you. No, he screamed, shaking his head violently. I don't belong here. I don't want this. His chest tightened, his breath quickening. Let me out. But the figure was relentless, moving closer with each word, with each breath. You are the house, and the house is you. This place was built for you. It was designed to keep you here. Thomas felt the panic surge in his veins. No, I'm not part of this place. I don't belong here. I've only been here for a few weeks. I just moved in. The shadow stretched and twisted as it responded. You think you can outrun your fate? You think you can escape the truth of what you are? His knees buckled beneath him. He collapsed to the floor, his mind racing as the walls began to close in. His hands grasped the ground, his fingertips scraping against the cold, damp wood of the floor. The very ground beneath him felt like it was alive, pulsating, moving, breathing. Get away from me. Thomas screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the oppressive hum that filled the air. The house seemed to be alive, its walls trembling, the floor shifting like it was sinking into a dark abyss. But no matter how much he tried to flee, no matter how hard he tried to pull himself out of the grip of the house, there was nowhere to go. He was trapped in its web, and the more he struggled, the more it seemed to tighten around him. He forced himself to his feet, his body trembling, and looked around desperately. I can't be part of this house. I'm not supposed to be here. I don't belong. The figure's cold, empty gaze seemed to burn into his very soul. It's too late to fight it now. The house groaned as if it was alive, its foundations creaking and cracking. The walls stretched, contorting as they had before, shifting and reshaping themselves. But this time it was worse. It was as if the house itself was rejecting Thomas, forcing him to realize something that he had been denying. His heart pounded, a growing sense of dread sweeping over him. He closed his eyes tightly, trying to block out the noise, the feeling, the haunting presence that seemed to grow with each passing second. I don't belong here, he cried out again, but his voice was barely a whisper. I'm not part of you. I'm just a man who moved in. The figure tilted its head, the blackness of its eyes consuming him. You have been here longer than you know. This house is your prison, Thomas. It is a part of you, just as you are a part of it. Suddenly, the room seemed to collapse inward, the walls pressing against him, suffocating him. The air grew colder, and the hum that had once been distant now surrounded him completely. His breath came in shallow gasps as he stumbled backward, desperately clawing at the walls, but there was no escape. The room was alive, pulsating with a dark energy that seemed to be pulling him deeper into the heart of the house. You're lying, Thomas shouted, his voice hoarse with terror. I've only been here a few weeks. I just moved in. The figure, the house, the very walls around him seemed to shift in response. A voice echoed through the darkness, distant but clear. Do you remember the night you came here? Thomas paused. He couldn't remember. His memories were foggy, distorted. The house. It was as if the very act of moving in had already been decided for him. He shook his head again, trying to force the memory to the surface. But nothing came. Remember, Thomas, the voice urged. Remember the night it all began. A flash of memory hit him like a tidal wave. The night he had first moved into the house. The house had seemed perfect then, so quaint, so charming. An old place with creaky floors, drafty rooms, and an almost comforting sense of mystery. It had called to him, drawn him in, but there had been something strange about it, something that had felt off from the very beginning. The shadows in the corners of the rooms, the feeling of being watched even when no one was there. He had tried to ignore it, but the house's grip had tightened, slowly at first, until it had become all-encompassing. The walls had started to shift. The rooms had started to feel wrong. And now, he was beginning to understand. "The house, it's alive," Thomas whispered, his voice shaking. The figure before him grinned, its smile wide and jagged. "Not just alive, Thomas. It's a part of you, and you are a part of it. The truth is that you can't leave, because you are the house. You always have been." The room seemed to close in around him as the figure's words echoed in his mind. Thomas couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The truth was too much to bear. He was the house. He was part of it, and there was no escape. Story 4. It began as a faint noise, barely noticeable, almost like the sound of a distant breeze or the rustling of leaves. But there was something odd about it, something unsettling. The sound was rhythmic, measured, like someone walking, but with no one there. At first, it was easy for John to brush it off as just the usual creaks and groans of an old building. After all, he had just moved into this apartment, and the place was filled with strange sounds. The first few nights had been a struggle. The unfamiliar walls, the strange layout, the heavy air of the apartment, it all felt too foreign. But it was the sound, the footsteps that seemed to echo in the stillness of the night, that unsettled him the most. Every night, at exactly the same time, 2:33 a.m., he would hear it, the soft tap, tap, tap of shoes on wood. The sound would start faintly at first, as if coming from the hallway just outside his door, and then gradually get closer. Every night, he'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, the noise growing louder with each passing minute. At first, he'd get up to check, but each time he opened the door, the hall would be empty. No one there, no sign of anyone having walked past. Yet, the footsteps would continue, inching closer, step by step, until they reached his bedroom door. And then, just like that, they would stop. He would stand there, heart pounding, waiting for something to happen, but nothing ever did. The apartment was silent once again. But tonight was different. The air felt heavier, like something was pressing against his chest. John tried to push away the nagging feeling, but it wouldn't leave him. He couldn't shake the sense that the footsteps were somehow more insistent. They weren't just passing by anymore. They were waiting. It was a Friday, and John had come home late from work. The usual chaos of the office had drained him, but as he stepped into his apartment, something felt off. The silence was too thick. It was like the apartment itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. John went through his routine, dropped his keys on the counter, tossed his jacket over the back of a chair, and poured himself a glass of water. But even as he moved around the apartment, he couldn't escape the eerie sensation of being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and every creak in the floorboards made him jump. When he finally sat down on the couch, the same pattern began to emerge. The clock on the wall ticked away, each second louder than the last, until finally, there it was, the sound. It was soft at first, just a slight tapping, like the distant patter of rain. But as John listened, it grew louder. The footsteps were unmistakable now. Tap, 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 echoing through the empty apartment. His heart began to race as the sound seemed to move toward him. It was coming from the hallway, but there was no one there. His breath quickened as he rose to his feet. He wasn't imagining this. He had heard it countless times before. It was real, but where was it coming from? Who was there? With a trembling hand, John reached for the door handle. He didn't want to open it. He knew there was nothing out there. but it was as if something inside him was forcing him to do it. He had to know. He had to see for himself. The hallway stretched out before him in the dim light, shadows clinging to the walls. He stepped out, his footsteps swallowed by the thick silence that surrounded him. The apartment was unnervingly still, but the sound, it was still there. It was louder now, closer. The footsteps were right outside his door. John's heart hammered in his chest as he moved down the hallway, each step echoing in the emptiness. He reached the end of the corridor and stopped dead in his tracks. The air was thick with tension, and the footsteps had stopped. The silence was deafening. Tap, tap, tap. John's breath caught in his throat. The sound came from behind him now, faint but unmistakable. Someone was walking right behind him. His body froze. He didn't dare turn around. The footsteps were soft, yet they were real. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like lead. It was as if the very act of turning around would shatter the fragile reality he was holding on to. Tap, tap, tap. It was closer now, right behind him. He could feel the presence, the weight of someone there. But when he spun around, there was no one, nothing. He was alone. But the footsteps, they didn't stop. The sound was still there, continuing on, moving slowly, deliberately, like it was coming from the walls themselves. John's mind raced. The sound didn't make sense. It was as if it was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. John stood there, his breath shallow, eyes wide with terror. The silence pressed in on him, unbearable, until it was broken by something else. A whisper. It wasn't loud at first. It was a breath, a soft, almost imperceptible murmur. But it was there, and it was coming from the direction of the hallway. John, the whisper echoed through the empty space, carrying a sense of familiarity. But who could it be? No one else lived here. There was no one else in the apartment. John, the whisper came again, louder this time, almost urgent. His heart skipped a beat. His name. Someone was saying his name. But how? Who was it? He turned toward the sound, his eyes scanning the darkened hallway. The whisper came again, and this time, it was right behind him. John, come closer. John's entire body went rigid. The voice was not human. It was distorted, unnatural, as if the sound itself was stretching and twisting. It was a voice, yes, but it was something more, a sound that shouldn't have existed. He felt the temperature in the apartment drop suddenly, the chill creeping into his bones. His hands shook as he gripped the doorframe, trying to steady himself. Something was wrong. Something was deeply, horribly wrong. The whisper faded, leaving only the cold silence. But John couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was still there, watching him, waiting for him to make a move. The footsteps, the whispers, the silence. They were all connected somehow, a part of something much bigger than he could understand. But what? And more importantly, why was it so determined to find him? John stood frozen in the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice that had whispered his name felt like it had seeped into his very soul, and he couldn't shake the unease that clung to him like a shadow. His hands trembled as he held onto the doorframe, trying to steady himself. He could still feel the cold presence in the air, as if someone was watching him, lurking just out of sight. The silence was deafening. For a moment, John wasn't sure whether the voice had been real, or if it was simply the product of his overactive imagination. But deep down, he knew it hadn't been just a figment of his mind. It had been too clear, too distinct, and it wasn't something he could explain away. He quickly moved back into the apartment, closing the door behind him. The creaking of the old wood beneath his feet seemed louder than usual, almost as if the building itself was responding to the unease that gripped him. As he stepped further into the living room, he noticed something odd. The room felt different. It wasn't just the oppressive silence. It was as if the walls themselves were shifting, closing in around him. John rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the feeling of vertigo. He'd been in this apartment for weeks now, and nothing like this had ever happened before. But tonight was different. The air was heavier, the atmosphere suffocating. He could almost feel the weight of something pressing down on him, as if the very structure of the building was alive. His mind raced. The footsteps, the whispers, the cold chill that had crept into the apartment. All of it pointed to something unnatural, something that shouldn't exist. But what was it? What was haunting him? As he moved through the apartment, he noticed that the furniture had shifted. The chairs, the tables, they were all in slightly different positions than where he had left them. It was subtle but unmistakable. The sense of unease deepened. Had he moved them without realizing? Was his mind playing tricks on him? No, this was something else. Something he couldn't explain. John went to the kitchen, desperate for something to ground him, something familiar. But when he opened the fridge, he froze. Inside there was a note, written in bold, jagged handwriting. "You can't escape." His breath caught in his throat. How had the note gotten there? He hadn't put it there. No one else lived in the apartment. The door had been locked the entire time. He slammed the fridge door shut, his pulse racing. His mind was spinning, but the words on the note kept echoing in his ears. "You can't escape." A sudden thud came from the hallway. It was a soft sound like a footstep, but louder, closer. John's head snapped toward the sound, his body frozen with dread. It was as if the apartment was alive, shifting, reacting to his every move. He didn't know what was happening, but he could feel the darkness creeping closer. The footsteps. They were back. Tap, tap, tap. John's heart skipped a beat as the sound echoed through the apartment once again. It was unmistakable. This time, it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from the living room. Slowly, deliberately, the footsteps moved closer, just outside the door to the kitchen. John felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He turned, his breath shallow, his body tense. But when he looked, there was no one there. Tap, tap, tap. The footsteps continued, but there was no sign of anyone. No one in the hallway. No one outside the door. John's mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. He wasn't crazy. This was real. Something was here with him. Something he couldn't see. Something that was toying with him. The sound stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. John's chest heaved with every breath, his pulse thundering in his ears. His mind screamed at him to leave, to run, to get out of the apartment. But he couldn't. He was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. And then he heard it. A soft, low whisper, like a breath on the wind, right behind him. "John." It wasn't the same voice as before. This time, it was different, slower, more deliberate. The voice seemed to curl around his name like a snake, slithering into his ears, into his mind. "John," the voice repeated, this time closer, as if it were standing just behind him. John spun around, his eyes wide with terror. There was no one there. The kitchen was empty. The apartment was empty. But the voice that didn't stop. "John." It was louder now, almost as if it was inside his head. John's hand shot to his temples, his fingers digging into his skull, as if trying to hold his brain in place. "Who are you?" he screamed, his voice hoarse with panic. "What do you want from me?" The voice didn't answer, but the air around him grew colder. The temperature in the room dropped rapidly, as if an unseen force was sucking all the warmth out of the apartment. John's breath became visible, puffing out in little white clouds as he gasped for air. And then in the silence, he heard it again, a footstep. This time, it wasn't distant. It was close, very close. It was right next to him, echoing in his ears like a drumbeat. John's head snapped to the side, his eyes searching the shadows. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to see what was behind him, but he had to. He had to know. With a trembling hand, he reached for the doorframe, bracing himself for whatever was about to come. And then there it was, the figure, a shadow, dark and formless, standing in the doorway. It was tall, looming like a human shape, but its features were distorted, shifting, as if it couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be. It was like staring at something out of the corner of your eye, something that didn't quite belong in this world. The footsteps stopped. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching him. John's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to run. He wanted to scream, but his body wouldn't obey. He was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the fear that had taken hold of him. "John," the voice whispered again, softer this time, almost soothing, as if it were trying to calm him. But there was no calming the terror that gripped him. He had to get out. He had to leave. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But as he turned to flee, he heard it, a sound that wasn't footsteps. It was louder, sharper, a door opening, slowly. It came from the other side of the room. John's heart stopped. There was nowhere left to run. The door creaked open slowly, the sound seeming to stretch on forever, as if time itself had been twisted within the walls of the apartment. John's heart hammered in his chest, every beat a reminder how trapped he felt in his own skin. The figure in the doorway was still there, unmoving, watching. It wasn't human, at least, not in any way he could understand. He should have run, but the weight of the air pressing down on him kept him rooted to the spot. The chill that filled the room earlier seemed to intensify, cutting through his clothes, numbing his limbs, freezing him in place. John's head was spinning, his vision blurring. The shadows in the room seemed to warp, shifting as if they were alive, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. Everything felt wrong, like reality was splintering apart at the seams. His mind raced, trying to find an explanation for what was happening. But there was none. No explanation. No answers. The door. It opened. His breath caught in his throat as he watched it. The ancient wooden door that led into the rest of the apartment, his sanctuary, his supposed refuge, creaked on its hinges. It swung open by itself, revealing an empty room. But was it really empty? His instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like stone. He couldn't move. He couldn't escape. "John," the voice again, that whisper, slow and deliberate, curling around him like smoke, wrapping itself around his thoughts. It was louder now, almost deafening, and yet still John could hear the faint echo of something else. Footsteps, approaching from the hallway outside. His mind was spiraling. What was happening to him? The figure at the door didn't seem real. It was too dark, too indistinct. But the voice, it was so clear, so real. He could feel it vibrating in his skull, reverberating through his very bones. "John," the voice repeated, and then, no sooner than the words left its ghostly lips, he felt a cold pressure on his chest. Something invisible was pushing down on him, making it hard to breathe. It wasn't a physical force. It was something far worse, something suffocating, something that made his lungs feel like they were being crushed from the inside out. John stumbled backward, the sound of his own heartbeat drowning out everything else. But even that was swallowed by the static noise filling the room, the faint voices murmuring in a language he couldn't understand. Footsteps. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to face it. But something, some compulsion stronger than his fear, forced him to glance toward the hallway. A figure stood there now, halfway in the shadows, its form just barely visible in the dim light from the kitchen. It was tall, too tall, its head almost brushing the top of the doorway. Its face was obscured, covered in blackness that stretched across it like a veil, and John couldn't see its eyes, but he could feel them, watching him. John tried to scream, but no sound came out. His voice was gone, lost in the suffocating silence. His legs refused to move, and his body shook uncontrollably as the figure began to move forward, stepping out of the shadows and into the hallway, its footsteps soft and deliberate. The air thickened as it came closer, the walls closing around John as the oppressive weight of the apartment became almost unbearable. The figure stopped just in front of him, standing there in the doorway. The temperature in the room plummeted, and John felt his breath fog in front of him. He wanted to run, but his feet were glued to the floor. And then, finally, it spoke. "Why did you come here, John?" The voice was deep, almost too deep, as though it was coming from somewhere far away, and yet somehow directly inside his head. John couldn't speak. His mind was frozen, unable to process the question. He hadn't come here. Not really. He hadn't chosen this apartment. He hadn't chosen any of this. But it didn't matter. It didn't matter what he thought. The figure in front of him knew. It knew everything. Why? The figure's voice was relentless, pressing into his mind, squeezing his thoughts until they were nothing but a tangled mess. Why did you open the door? The words reverberated inside him, echoing in the hollow parts of his mind. John tried to take a step back, but he couldn't move. He couldn't escape. "I didn't mean to," he managed to say, his voice barely a whisper, as if the words themselves were too heavy to speak aloud. The figure tilted its head, its face still hidden in the darkness. It took a slow step forward, and John felt the weight of its presence, like it was filling every inch of the apartment. The walls seemed to shift, and the room around him seemed to warp and bend, as if the very space he was in wasn't stable anymore. "You should have stayed away," the figure whispered, its voice low and guttural. "Now you are part of it." The word sent a chill through John's body, making him feel like the world was slipping out of his grasp. The apartment was no longer a place of safety. It was no longer home. It was something else, something alive, something hungry. John's mind began to break apart, the pieces slipping away into the abyss as the figure reached out toward him. The temperature dropped even further, and John felt his limbs going numb, his body refusing to obey his frantic thoughts. The footsteps, they were back, but this time they weren't coming from the hallway. They were coming from inside the apartment, behind him. He spun around, his heart hammering his chest, but there was no one there. The living room was empty. The kitchen door was closed. No one stood in the hallway. And yet, the footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. "John," the voice whispered again, this time right in his ear. He could feel the breath against his skin, cold and unnatural, and it sent a wave of terror through his body. He turned back to the figure, but it had vanished. It was gone. The apartment was silent once more, save for the faint static hum that filled the air. John stood there, his breath coming in ragged gasps, trying to understand what was happening. He had to escape. He had to leave before whatever this was consumed him, before it tore him apart. But as he moved toward the door, he heard the sound again, the footsteps. This time they were not distant. They were right behind him. Closer, closer. He turned around quickly, but again there was nothing there. Nothing. And yet, the voice. John. It was coming from everywhere now. The walls, the ceiling, the very air around him. John screamed, but it was swallowed by the oppressive silence. And the footsteps, they kept coming. Closer, closer. Story 5. It all started on a typical Monday morning. Jason had never been a heavy sleeper. In fact, sleep had always been a struggle for him, a realm that fell out of reach. He'd heard the same tired advice 100 times. "Just relax," they'd say. "Close your eyes and let your mind drift." But every time, his mind became a flood of restless thoughts, keeping him wide awake. That was until he met Dr. Bernard, a peculiar sleep specialist who claimed to have discovered something extraordinary, something that could change Jason's life forever. He'd heard of people who could enter others' dreams, but this was different. Dr. Bernard didn't just help people sleep. He had found a way to let people borrow dreams. Real dreams, not just a hazy visions your mind conjured up when sleep crept in. You can experience someone else's dreams, Dr. Bernard had explained during their first meeting. Feel their desires, their fears, their hopes. But it comes with a price. Jason, skeptical at first, had dismissed it as another gimmick, but desperate for some relief, he had agreed to try it. The first time he borrowed someone else's dream was an experience like nothing he could have imagined. He closed his eyes, focused on the soothing sound of Dr. Bernard's voice, and the next thing he knew, he was no longer in the sterile clinic. Instead, he was standing on the edge of a golden beach, the waves gently lapping at his feet. The sun was warm on his skin, and the air smelled of salt and freedom. He felt at peace. It was a dream that wasn't his, yet it felt real. He could hear the laughter of children nearby, feel the soft sand beneath his toes, and even taste the sweetness of the ocean breeze. For once, his mind was free. The chaos, the noise had all faded away. The dream lasted only for what felt like hours. But when Jason awoke, he was no longer in the sterile clinic. He was back in his apartment, the sunlight creeping through the curtains. He felt different, refreshed, and for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. "Did you like it?" Dr. Bernard asked the next time they met. His smile was knowing, almost as if he expected Jason to be impressed. "I've never felt so calm in my life," Jason admitted. "It was perfect." "That's just the beginning," Dr. Bernard had said cryptically. "But be careful, Jason. Dream borrowing is a delicate art. The line between reality and dreams. It's thinner than you think." Jason didn't pay much attention to the warning. He was too overwhelmed by the feeling of peace. He wanted more of that serenity, more of that calmness, and more of that escape. So he returned to Dr. Bernard's clinic week after week, borrowing dream after dream. At first, the dreams were spectacular. They weren't always idyllic beaches. Sometimes they were exhilarating experiences, like flying over cities or discovering lost worlds. He had dreams of success, dreams of wealth, and dreams of romance. Each night, he would slip into someone else's world, and each morning, he would wake up feeling more alive than he ever had before. But it didn't take long for things to take a turn. One night, as Jason prepared to sleep, Dr. Bernard handed him a new dream. "This one's a bit different," he said with a knowing look, "but I think you're ready for it." Jason didn't think twice. He lay back, relaxed, and closed his eyes. The dream started like the others. At first, it was beautiful. He was walking through a lush, green forest, the sounds of nature around him. The air was fresh and clean, and everything felt perfect. But then the dream began to shift. The trees grew taller, their shadows stretching far beyond what was natural. The sun that had once bathed the scene in warmth disappeared, leaving behind an eerie, unnatural twilight. Jason felt his heart rate quicken. Something wasn't right. The path he had been following twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the forest. He felt watched, but when he looked around, there was no one. Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled. A cold wind whipped through the trees, sending a chill through his spine. He heard a faint sound in the distance, something that made his blood run cold. It was a whisper, but it wasn't a voice he recognized. Jason stumbled backward, his breath shallow. He turned to leave, but the path had vanished. The forest had shifted in an instant, and now there was no way out. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. The whispering grew louder, until it was no longer a whisper at all. It was a scream, a deafening, shrill sound that echoed around him. It wasn't human. It wasn't even animal. It was something else, something dark, something ancient. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he ran, the ground beneath him shaking with each step. He felt the presence closing in on him, felt it breathing down his neck. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it, lurking just beyond his sight, ready to strike. He tried to wake up, tried to escape the nightmare, but it was as if the dream had a hold on him. No matter how hard he fought, No matter how hard he tried to open his eyes, he couldn't break free. Finally, just as he thought he couldn't take it anymore, the dream released him. He woke up, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. His heart was still racing, and his mind was spinning. The room around him was still the same, but everything felt different. The air was thick with something he couldn't quite place. The line between the dream and reality had blurred, and Jason wasn't sure where one ended and the other began. When he met Dr. Bernard the next day, he was shaken. "You warned me about the price," Jason said, his voice barely a whisper. "But I didn't know it would be like this." Dr. Bernard's expression was unreadable. "That's the danger of borrowed dreams, Jason," he said softly. "The nightmares come with them. The more you borrow, the harder it becomes to separate your world from theirs." But Jason didn't listen. He wanted more. The thrill, the excitement, the feeling of being alive. He craved it all. Days turned into weeks, and the line between Jason's waking life and the dreams he borrowed became increasingly blurred. The thrill of living through someone else's experiences, of walking through their memories, was intoxicating. But as the weeks wore on, the dreams began to change. It started with small things. He would wake up feeling an unease that hadn't been there before. A flicker of dread that lingered long after he opened his eyes, like a shadow that wouldn't leave his side. He didn't understand it at first. The dreams he borrowed were still exhilarating, still vivid, but now they had a weight to them. They weren't the pleasant, calming dreams of beaches or grand adventures anymore. They were darker. Jason couldn't put his finger on when it started, but the horrors began to creep in. It wasn't long before the whispering from the dream began to spill over into his waking life. He would hear in the background, faint and indistinct, like static on a broken radio. It would be there when he was reading, when he was driving, when he was trying to sleep. It was a presence, something always there, just out of his reach. He tried to tell himself that it was just his mind playing tricks on him. After all, he'd been borrowing dreams from people who were far more disturbed than he was. Their nightmares, their fears, were not his to bear. But that didn't stop him from feeling the weight of them, pressing on his chest every time he closed his eyes. And then one night, something happened that Jason couldn't explain. He had borrowed a dream from a man who had survived a horrific accident, a man whose life had been forever changed by the trauma. Jason had hoped to experience the man's courage, his resilience, but what he had gotten instead was the feeling of falling. He wasn't sure where he was. The dream was so disjointed, so fractured, it was hard to make sense of, but there was one constant, the feeling of falling. The ground beneath him would collapse. The sky above would shift and twist into something unrecognizable. It felt like he was spiraling, his body weightless, being pulled down into a never-ending abyss. And then, when he thought it couldn't get worse, he heard the voices again, the same whispering, now clearer, more insistent. It was a cacophony of voices, each one demanding something, pulling him in 1,000 different directions. Some of them were familiar, some of them weren't, but they all shared one thing in common. They wanted him. They wanted him to stay. Jason tried to wake up, tried to free himself from the nightmare, but he couldn't. The dream was holding him captive, refusing to let him go. He could feel his heart racing in his chest, could feel the sweat on his brow as he struggled to breathe. The more he tried to escape, the more the whispers intensified, the more his mind unraveled, until he wasn't sure what was real anymore. When he finally woke up, gasping for air, he was in his apartment, but it didn't feel like it. The walls seemed to pulse, the air thick with a strange pressure, as if the very room itself was closing in on him. He stood up, disoriented, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had he really been dreaming? Or had the dream become something else? Something more real? It didn't take long for Jason to start seeing the cracks in his reality. He would catch glimpses of people who weren't there, faces half-formed in reflections or in the corner of his vision, shadows that seemed to move when he wasn't looking. And the whispers, They were always there now, like a broken record playing in the background of his mind. Jason tried to explain it away. He told himself it was the stress, the long hours at work, the exhaustion from too many nights spent borrowing dreams. But deep down he knew something was wrong. The more he borrowed, the more the boundaries between his dreams and the real world seemed to disintegrate. It was as though his mind was splitting, fracturing into multiple realities. And the more he gave into the dreams, the more he lost touch with the world he once knew. Then, one night, the whispers stopped, and Jason was left with silence so profound, so deafening, that it almost drove him mad. He was sitting in his living room, trying to read a book, when the silence descended. There was no whispering, no static in the air, just a deep, suffocating silence. He glanced around, his breath caught in his throat. It was as though the entire world had been muted, as though everything around him had been swallowed up by the void. He stood up, pacing the room, his heart pounding in his chest. Where had they gone? The voices that had once haunted him, the static that had driven him to the brink of madness. Where were they? As he moved toward the window, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The reflection in the glass wasn't his own. It was a man, tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that stared back at him. The man's face was twisted in a grotesque grin, and his mouth moved, forming words that Jason couldn't hear. Jason's hand trembled as he reached for the door, but before he could touch the handle, the reflection in the window began to move. The man in the glass stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Jason's. Jason stumbled back, his pulse racing, his mind screaming for him to run, to escape. But the man in the reflection was already there, his hand pressing against the glass as if trying to reach through to him. And then, with a sound like cracking ice, the glass shattered. Jason screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the dark room. He turned, his heart pounding, only to find that the man in the reflection was no longer just a reflection. He was standing right in front of him, real, tangible, his hollow eyes staring directly into Jason's soul. The whispers returned, louder this time. Jason could hear them clearly now. The voices of the people whose dreams he had borrowed, their fears and desires merging into one twisted, horrifying chorus. They were all around him, filling the room, suffocating him. And then he heard one voice, louder than the rest. "You can't escape us," it said, its voice cold and hollow. Jason tried to scream, tried to move, but it was too late. The man in front of him grinned wider, his mouth stretching impossibly wide. "You've taken too much," the voice whispered. "Now it's our turn to take you." Jason's world collapsed on itself, his vision blackening as the dreams he had borrowed consumed him entirely. Jason woke up with a jolt, gasping for air. The sensation of suffocation lingered in his chest, as if his lungs had been crushed beneath the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. His body trembled, his skin cold and clammy, his heart pounding erratically. He sat up in his bed, taking in the dim light of the morning that filtered through his curtains, but the room felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. His apartment was the same. The walls, the furniture, the clock on the wall. It was all as it should be. But Jason felt a distinct, unsettling presence of something foreign, something insidious in the air. It wasn't just a nightmare from a night before or the twisted reflection that had tried to break through his reality. No, it was something else. Something worse. The whispers were gone. The suffocating silence had swallowed them up, but it wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, a vacuum of stillness that gnawed at his sanity. He stood up slowly, his legs weak beneath him, as if the act of moving might bring the nightmare to life once again. He stumbled toward the bathroom, desperate to wash away the residue of the horror that clung to him. As he reached the sink and splashed cold water onto his face, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. The man in the reflection wasn't him. It was someone else entirely. Jason recoiled, his heart skipping a beat, his breath catching in his throat. He wiped his face, rubbed his eyes, and then looked again. This time, he saw his own face, but it was distorted, pale, with hollow eyes that were too wide, too empty. A cold shiver ran down his spine as he turned away from the mirror, unable to face the face that wasn't his own. "Not real," he muttered under his breath. "It's just a dream, just a dream." But he couldn't shake the feeling that he had crossed a line he could never uncross. The dreams, or were they memories, he had borrowed had begun to infect his reality. His thoughts, his perceptions, had become so warped that he couldn't distinguish where the dream ended and the real world began. He had told himself, over and over, that he was in control. He could borrow dreams, experience other lives, and return to his own. It was supposed to be an escape, a temporary pleasure. But now, it was no longer a matter of control. He was no longer the one who chose what to dream. The dreams had chosen him, and the price of borrowing them was more than he had ever anticipated. Jason stepped back into the living room, still dazed. His mind was a maze of confusion, swirling with fragments of forgotten nightmares. He moved aimlessly, as though trying to escape the invisible weight pressing on his chest. He needed answers. He needed to understand what was happening to him. But every time he closed his eyes, the world around him seemed to shift, as though the very fabric of reality was coming undone. The walls bent, the floor shifted beneath his feet, and the whispers returned, louder now, not in his ears, but in his very mind. "Help us." The voice was chilling, a soft, guttural whisper that made Jason's blood run cold. He clutched his head, trying to block it out, but it was as if the voice had lodged itself deep inside his skull, echoing with every thought he had. "Please, no more." He staggered backward, his hand grazing the edge of the table. And then something caught his eye. It was a photograph, the one from the old woman's dream, the woman whose nightmare had haunted him, the one who had first introduced him to the darkness lurking just beneath the surface of his mind, the woman whose life had been twisted and broken by the things she had witnessed in her dreams. The photo had been sitting on his desk for days now, ever since he had borrowed her dream. He hadn't looked at it before, but now, as he stood frozen in front of it, he couldn't help but stare. The photo was old, faded, and yet the faces of the people in it were clear. The woman, her young daughter, and a man who seemed to be standing slightly behind them. Jason couldn't quite place it, but there was something unsettling about the image. It felt wrong. He picked it up, his fingers trembling as he traced the outline of the faces. And then he noticed something he hadn't before. The man in the photograph. He looked like Jason. It was impossible, but there it was. The same dark eyes, the same sharp features, the same haunted expression. It was as though he were looking at a reflection of himself, but it wasn't his own face. Not completely. Jason's breath caught in his throat. "What is this?" The whispers grew louder in his ears, as if the photograph had opened a doorway to the truth he wasn't ready to face. He tried to shake it off, tried to tell himself it was a trick of the mind, but the more he looked at the photo, the more the faces in it seemed to move, to shift. The figures in the background blurred, as though they were fading into the shadows, but the man, the one who looked like Jason, remained, his eyes staring directly at him, as though waiting for him to understand. And then it clicked. The man in the photograph wasn't just someone from the woman's life. He was Jason. Or at least, he was a version of Jason. A version from a dream. A nightmare. Jason dropped the photograph, his hand shaking as it clattered to the floor. His mind was spinning, the world around him warping and bending as the realization settled in. He had crossed a threshold, a line that he could never uncross. He had borrowed dreams, yes, but not just anyone's. He had borrowed pieces of lives, fragments of souls, and they were beginning to take root in his own. The man in the photograph was him, and yet not him. He had become a part of someone else's nightmare, and now that nightmare was swallowing him whole. Jason backed away from the desk, his breathing erratic. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the very space around him was closing in. The whispers reached a crescendo, a maddening cacophony that drowned out all rational thought. They were all speaking at once, their voices merging into a single, unified demand. Join us. Jason couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't fight the feeling that was overtaking him. He felt himself slipping, falling into the abyss of the dreams that had stolen his mind. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his head as the world around him dissolved into darkness. The room, his apartment, everything, it all faded, leaving nothing but the endless, suffocating blackness. And then he heard it, the voice of the woman whose dream he had borrowed. Her voice was soft, soothing, but it carried a weight of despair that Jason couldn't escape. "You shouldn't have taken so much," she whispered, her voice carrying a note of finality. "Now you'll never wake up." Jason's vision blurred, his body numb. The nightmare had consumed him. He had borrowed dreams, but now it was his own dream that was collapsing, pulling him deeper into its dark, unending spiral. He closed his eyes, the last thing he saw being the face of the man in the photograph, staring back at him, forever. And then there was only silence. The end. Thank you for joining me in this dark and twisted journey. I hope you enjoyed tonight's tale. If you want more chilling stories, make sure to subscribe to MR.DARXNIGHTS and hit that bell icon so you never miss an eerie moment. Don't forget to leave a like and share this with others who dare to listen. Until next time, stay in the shadows and remember, the night never truly ends.